towards modernization, the Industrial Revolution, displacing indigenous peoples, parts to modernization. Towards modernization. In the previous section, you have read about certain crucial developments in the medieval and early modern world: feudalism, the European Renaissance, and the encounters between Europeans and the peoples of the Americas. As you would have realized, some of the phenomena that contributed to the making of our modern world gradually evolved in this period, and especially so from the mid 15th century onwards. Two further developments in world history created a context for what has been called modernizations. These were the Industrial Revolution and a series of political revolutions that transformed subjects into citizens, beginning with the American Revolution 1776 to 81 and the French Revolution 1789 to 94. Britain has been the world's first industrial nation, and you will read about how this came to be in Theme 9. For long it was believed the British industrialization provided the model for industrialization in other countries. The discussions of Theme 9 will show how historians have begun to question some of the earlier ideas about the Industrial Revolutions. Each country drew upon the experiences of other nations without necessarily reproducing any model. In Britain, for instance, coal and cotton textile industries were developed in the first phase of industrialization, while the invention of railways initiated the second stage of that process. In other countries, such as Russia, which began to industrialize much later from the late 19th century onwards, the railway and other heavy industry emerged in the initial phase of industrialization itself. Likewise, the role of the state and of banks in industrializations has differed from country to country. The treatment of the British case in Theme 9 will hopefully whet your curiosity about the industrial trajectories of other nations such as the USA and Germany, two significant industrial powers. Theme 9 also emphasizes the human and materials cost incurred by Britain on its industrialization, the plight of the laboring poor, especially of children, environmental degradations, and the consequent epidemics of cholera and tuberculosis. Linking the world in 1927, Charles Lindbergh, 25 years old, flew across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris in a single-engine aeroplane. In Theme 11, you will similarly read about industrial pollution and cadmium and mercury poisoning in Japan that steered people into mass movements against indiscriminate industrialization. Linking the world, J. Lipschitz figure sculpted in 1920s saw the influences of Central African statuary. European powers began to colonize parts of America and Asia, and South Africa well before the Industrial Revolution. Theme 10 tells you in the story of what European settlers did to the native peoples of America and Australia. The bourgeois mentality of the settler made them buy and sell everything, including land and water, but the natives who appeared uncivilized to European Americans, asked, if you do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can one buy them? The natives did not feel the need to own land, fish, or animals. They had no desire to commodify them. If things needed to be exchanged, they could simply be gifted. Quite obviously, the natives and the Europeans represented competing notions of civilization. The former did not allow the European deluxe to wipe out their culture, although the US and Canadian governments of the mid-20th century desired natives to join the mainstream, and the Australian authorities of the same period attempted to simply ignore their traditions and culture. One might wonder what is meant by mainstream. How does economic and political power influence the making of mainstream cultures? Linking the world, Japanese Zen painting like this one were admired by Western artists and influenced the abstract expressionist style of painting in the 1920s in the USA. Western capitalism's mercantile, industrial, and financial, and early 20th century Japanese capitalism created colonies in large parts of the Third World. Some of these were settled colonies. Others, such as British rule in India, are examples of direct imperial control. The case of 19th and early 20th century China illustrates a third variant of imperialism. Here, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, America, and Japan meddled in Chinese affairs without directly taking over state power. They exploited the country's resources to their own advantage, seriously compromising Chinese sovereignty and reducing the country to the status of a semi-colony. Almost everywhere colonial exploitation was challenged by powerful nationalist movements. Nationalisms, however, also arose without a colonial context, as in the West or Japan. All nationalisms are doctrine of popular sovereignty. Nationalist movements believe that political power should rest with the people, and this is what makes nationalism a modern concept. Civic nationalism vests sovereignty in all people regardless of language, ethnicity, religions, or gender. It seeks to create a community of rights exercising citizens and defines nationhood in terms of citizenship, not ethnicity or religions. Ethnic and religious nationalisms try to build national solidarities around a given language, religion, or set of tradition, defining the people ethnicity not in terms of common citizenship. In a multi-ethnic country, ethnic nationalists might limit the exercise of sovereignty to a chosen people, often assumed to be superior to minority communities. Today, most Western countries define their nationhood in terms of common citizenship and not by common ethnicity. One prominent exception in Germany, where ideas of ethnic nationalisms have had a long and troubling career going back to the reaction against the French imperial occupations of German states in 1806. Ideologies of civic nationalisms have vied with those of ethnic or religious nationalism the world over, and this has been so in modern India, China, and Japan as well. As with industrializations, so with parts to modernization, different societies have evolved their distinctive modernities. The Japanese and Chinese cases are very instructive in this regard. Japan succeeded in remaining free of colonial control and achieved fairly rapid economic and industrial progress throughout the 20th century. The rebuilding of the Japanese economy after a humiliating defeat in the Second World War should not be seen as a mere post-war miracle. As Theme 11 shows, it resulted from certain gains that had already been accomplished in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Did you know? For instance, that by 1910, tuition fees for studying at a primary school had more or less ended and enrollment had become universal. Japan's path to modernization, like that of any other country, has had its own tensions, those between democracy and militarism, ethnic nationalisms and civic nation building, and between what many Japanese describe as tradition and westernization. The Chinese resisted colonial exploitation and their own bureaucratic landed elite through a combination of peasant rebellion, reform and revolution. By the early 1930s, the Chinese Communist Party, which drew its strength from peasant mobilization, had begun confronting the imperial powers as well as the nationalists who represented the country's elite. It had also started implementing its ideas in selected pockets of the country. Its egalitarian ideology, stress on land reforms, and awareness of women's problems helped it overthrew foreign imperialism and nationalists in 1949. Once in power, it succeeded in reducing inequalities, spreading education, and creating political awareness. Even so, the country's single-party framework and state repressions contributed to considerable dissatisfaction with the political system after the mid-1960s, but the Chinese Communist Party has been able to retain control over the country largely because the embracing certain market principles. It reinvented itself and has worked hard to transform China into an economic powerhouse. The different ways in which various countries have understood modernity and sought to achieve it, each in the context of its own circumstances and ideas, make a fascinating story. This section introduced you to some aspects of that story.